Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? This week's news items include a sort of news item relating to pregnancy supplements, and the rather expected reality that you may not be getting what you think you are. The association of a certain viral DNA insertion into the human genome and the association with psychiatric disorders. A suspect, but theoretically possible relationship between taking shrooms and improving long COVID outcomes. One person has dedicated just about all of their lifetime to sending in noise complaints about aircraft flying overhead when they live on a flight path. The Japanese company plans to build the Tower of Babel, a space ladder, by 2050. Evidence of the earliest rain on Earth is trapped within very ancient crystals, and a Canadian researcher has claimed that they were barred from research into a mysterious brain illness, although there are some very big questions about it. The timestamps for these and other news items can be found in the description box below. Starting with a quasi-dystopian, if not Orwellian, topic, we have Tokyo Metropolitan Government, a part of Japan's larger government and responsible for their most populated city, launching a dating app to help promote the birth rate. And not just promote the birth rate, but literally promote it by making it higher. Japan and Tokyo particularly have seen a shrinking population. This is down to a wide range of factors, not the least of which is Japan is incredibly expensive to live in. However, the government is not happy about this, mostly because, their tax base is shrinking, and if there's not people paying tax, the government doesn't really look very good. To solve this, we have a dating app that is, not that amazing. It's effectively Tinder, but for Tokyo. The government in Tokyo has claimed that 70% of people who want to get married aren't actually seeking out anyone to get married to, which is a rather alarming figure, and so their app is, in their words, a gentle push to find someone. Statistically, this and other efforts by government in Japan, and local governments for that matter, make sense, as there were twice as many people dying as there were newborns in Japan just last year alone, which means Japan's population will shrink. There is no two ways about that. In other news related to fertility and pregnancy, we have the role supplements play, and particularly prenatal supplements. More importantly, it's that many supplements aren't actually providing you with what you think they are providing. And this is really important. Not just do the prenatal supplements provide you with benefits above and beyond better health for you, but also set your body up and provide necessary support for a developing infant. If you're not getting what you think you're getting, specifically things like folic acid, iron, vitamin D, calcium, and docosahexaenic acid, you're not going to get anywhere near the kind of benefit you think you will. This is another reason why the supplement industry is incredibly questionable. And not just are they providing you with a product that they claim will provide you with these benefits, but they're not delivering them. That means that not only will pregnant women, but also their developing fetuses, not get the benefit that they want. And unfortunately, this is not a unusual phenomena. A simple example of this is that many pregnancy supplements, or prenatal supplements more specifically, don't contain an adequate amount of folate or folic acid, both being effectively the same thing. One's just synthetic, and as a result, the benefit you're supposed to get is at best blunted, and in the worst case scenario, not going to provide you with the actual necessary benefits around the prevention of birth defects, something that most people would consider desirable. In other sort of birth-related news, it's the relationship between a circumcision and HIV. Not exactly the relationship you might expect, mostly because circumcision tends to be, either a cultural or a religious practice, and really doesn't affect the tendency of individuals to partake in dangerous sexual activities. But there is a weird relationship, mostly down to the let's say, a protective function that the foreskin has. The study, which is purely observational, so take this with a lot of salt, claims that the foreskin can impede the infection with STDs or STIs, whichever you find most current, and therefore, reduces the infection rate, quite simply. There is a sort of, if not fairly major caveat to this, and that is the research was conducted in China, and it was looking at blood tests between two groups of randomly assigned males. The randomly assigned males voluntarily underwent circumcision and, waited to see how many of them came back with HIV, which is a rather disconcerting study design. Further to that, all of the participants were male, which tells you pretty much where they're focusing their study, and that is homosexuals, gay, whatever you wish to call them. They were all between 18 and 49, and they all had multiple partners over the same year, which is another significant factor. Unfortunately, there is a relationship between a increase in proclivity and a increased risk of STD infection. This does mean, quite simply, that, all the participants involved were already in a high-risk category. When you look at the numbers, there's roughly 123 and 124 in each group. There were 124 males in the intervention group, that is, those who received a circumcision. And among those, about 5 of those individuals became HIV positive. The 123 individuals who received a circumcision at the end of the study had 0 seroconversions or 0 reported infections. Given how serious a topic of this, let's give some levity at least before we finish it up, and that is, it was published in the Annals of Internal Medicine. It could also be pronounced the Annuals of Internal Medicine. But no, in all seriousness, this is not necessarily a major finding, mostly because the study is incredibly underpowered for what it is. This, of course, is reasonable to expect, given that, you're going to have a massive challenge convincing ethics boards, and since this is a cooperative effort between US researchers and Chinese researchers, you're going to have to convince both states. And in this term, we're talking about the universities within America, which have much more stringent ethics requirements, versus the boards within China, which tend to be somewhat more lenient, at least in relative terms. In other viral news, and this time shifting away from something purely pathogenic in the modern sense, to the role of viruses in modern diseases but psychiatric disorders instead. There is a surprisingly large amount of our DNA that can be traced back to foreign pathogens, and of that, a more significant portion is down to viruses, because they get inserted into our DNA. Now, these viruses are called retroviruses. Herpes is a perfect example of this. While not the most exciting news, and obviously something already well known, it's the relationship that some of these viral DNA insertions could play in psychiatric disorders such as schizophrenia that is more interesting, mostly because it could prove to be a target, and let's be very clear about it, this is taking the research many steps further along for treatment that currently can't really be used effectively. The majority of the areas they're looking at were at least previously considered junk DNA. That is DNA that had no obvious role to play in the DNA sequences that were used for anything else. So for example, they didn't have a regulatory role, they didn't produce proteins, they didn't seem to do much of anything. And now obviously, knowing more about the genome and the gradual development of our knowledge in that area, having at least conducted multiple sequencing attempts, we know that, although yes, we don't know its role, it's certainly not junk. The findings are sort of preliminary, mostly down to the fact that, again, we're talking about a purely observational study, but at least they had a real sample to get. They used brain samples from 800 autopsied individuals, and when they cross-referenced their findings with larger genetic studies, they were able to find that there are at least 4 different viral insertions that were linked with a increased susceptibility to major disorders, things like schizophrenia or depression, even bipolar disorder. So they believe that this may indicate, and let's be clear, This is a very questionable finding, given that they haven't been able to demonstrate it in a real ongoing scenario that these particular viral insertions contribute to your risk of developing these psychiatric disorders. Or it could be that the researchers themselves are also currently mentally ill and imagining things. Next we go to diseases that are current and very worrying, and it's bird flu. And unfortunately there's been another death in another country due to avian influenza. This time, at least, it's reasonably close to America, where someone in Mexico has died. We say fortunately only because it means that the outbreak is spreading, but spreading in a reasonably controlled manner. Controlled in that it's not just jumping from one country to another country many thousands of miles away or kilometers away, and completely jumping other countries in between. The problem with this isn't so much that it's another death, it's another death of the H5N2 variant. The H5N2, and more accurately the AH5N2 variant, is not the same one spreading in America. And that's where the worry lies. Not only do we have to worry about the whole outbreak itself, but, well, it's now a new variant, and, well, everybody knows after COVID what fun variants bring. The very thin silver lining to this finding, and let's be clear, it's taking the idea of good news at a very long stretch, is that the 59-year-old man, so at least somewhat old, had a number of comorbidities, including chronic kidney disease, type 2 diabetes, and hypertension. This does indicate that he was already in a high-risk category for, well, dying in general, but dying due to infection with any disease, let alone bird flu, which is already known to be rather nasty at the moment, with a 50% fatality rate in some countries that have reported findings on it. However, the findings for those studies were with regards to the H5N1 variant, which is what you've seen in America. In news about variants, we have something about COVID that might be useful, and it's that using hallucinogens may help with long COVID, but this is all based on a single patient, so it's effectively a case study. And, well, case studies are nice, but they're more a way of saying, here's something really cool and interesting, let's have a look at it, and you guys can see if you can recreate it, or if it's relevant to what you've done. The 41-year-old woman was using shrooms to, well, basically deal with her shit. Unfortunately, in dealing with it, the patient was infected with COVID-19, and although they experienced the usual symptoms of fatigue, depression, anxiety, joint pain, and headaches, they weren't really getting better until the magic mushrooms solved her problems, which really does put the magic in magic mushrooms. Now, we have some fairly major questions about the report from the individual about what they were attempting prior to using magic mushrooms to resolve their long COVID, mostly because it involved things like fasting, massage therapy, acupuncture, and meditation. These are not exactly treatments that would typically help with resolving a long COVID. Further, the individual involved was studying a PhD, which would indicate that they're already in a high-stress environment and quite possibly already actively using other drugs of various kinds. Further to that, there are issues around the fact that not only were they taking multiple doses over a period of time, but they were also taking increasing doses of both magic mushrooms and MDMA. It is fundamentally, as said, an example of someone finding something interesting and publishing it for others to see and consider whether or not they want to try a more substantial study, specifically thinking of something like a randomized clinical trial. Clinical trial perhaps being a slight exaggeration for what they'd have to do. In archaeological news, we have Iron Age skeletons and the evidence they provide of blood sacrifice, which is rather uncomfortable. Understand that the evidence is by no means complete and absolute. It's more that the archaeologists have interpreted it as indicating that there was blood sacrifice, which isn't necessarily wrong either. The way they've reached this conclusion is based on the cut marks left on her skeletal remains, and the nature of the skeletal remains themselves indicating that although the cut marks show that there was a brutal death, it was also an indication that her life was hardly easy, with signs of wear and tear in other ways. What's important to this finding is not necessarily that, they found evidence of a blood sacrifice. Well, actually, that's exactly it. The problem is simple. There hasn't been a lot of evidence, physical evidence for that matter, of these practices, at least in England. And that's the weird thing. There's plenty of reports, but there's not a lot of physical evidence until now, which this is, although only a single site, it does add to the relatively small group of evidence of the practice being done. The pit itself was not only filled with her remains, but she was surrounded by horse and cow bones, indicating that this had been deliberately set up and then, done. The other element to this is that they may not necessarily have been, let's say, a local who was buried. Instead, it's entirely possible that their involvement in this ritual was less than voluntary. Going to rather more light-hearted news now, we have an individual who needs to find a better way to spend their time rather than complaining about the noise produced by aircraft flying overhead on an established flight path. They have accounted for about 20,000 complaints out of a total of 51,000 complaints in 2023. That means they're responsible for nearly half of all complaints in 2023 alone. With the over 20,000 complaints they submitted and the rather obvious 365 days in a year, we can say that they wrote more than 27 complaints a day. That means they're writing one complaint every hour and then some, assuming that they just don't sleep. And if not, numbers get much higher, and means that they basically have a full-time occupation complaining. Now, let's be clear about it. It's obviously not going to be fun living under that much noise all the time. However, there is an important caveat to it, and that is, generally speaking, those who live under airlines like this tend to be in a lower socioeconomic environments, and as such, the other claims related to decreased performance, health issues, so on and so forth, tend to be not entirely and absolutely related to aircraft flying overhead. And therein lies the problem. This person has spent so much time complaining that they could be better spending that time on something related to improving their circumstances. Now, we're not talking about necessarily engaging in, say, running or other physical exercise, as according to new research, there may be a downside to being physically active, or at least physically active to an excessive degree. Interestingly, it could be having an adverse effect on your immune system. What the researchers looked at was a large number of molecules within your blood that occur after exercise. Now, it's important to note that not only were they looking at a very large number, which is already something of a concern, but they were also looking specifically at the firefighters, which means they've got a very narrowly tailored subset. And finally, they only looked at 11 individuals. Yeah, this is a problem. The findings aren't going to be at all able to be extrapolated out to anybody else because it's such a very narrow subset of the population and the sample size is so small. What they did do was try and figure out whether or not 45 minutes of intense exercise involving carrying about 20 kilograms or roughly 40 pounds of weight over a hilly environment caused, the various molecules they looked at. Now, the other issue with it is those molecules, remembering that there were 4,700. That's a huge number. And that huge number is a concern, as you can find a relationship eventually in that kind of sampling process. The major factors they looked at were two in the end, and these two markers looked at inflammation and opioorphin. Inflammation was a factor they found that was decreased, which isn't necessarily bad. It's surprising to be clear, but it's not necessarily bad. The other, opioorphin, is a dilator of peripheral blood vessels, which is what you'd expect when you're exercising, mostly down to the human body's stress response. It redirects all of the energy that you would put into things like the digestive tract and puts it into the peripheral blood vessels so that muscles can use it. So you have a decreased inflammation, mostly down to the fact that inflammation uses energy the body can't afford to be redirecting into that process when, for example, you're running away from a bear. Of course, that's not the only finding they found. After all, they also took oral swabs, saliva samples, and a bunch of other things, which again, they're basically looking for a needle in a haystack, but they instead chose to make their own haystack. Overall, the research is heavily contested, and as such, it should be taken with a lot of salt if you're going to consider it. A much more reliable form of negative consequence, let's say, to exercise is the environmental effect, where, well, simply through breathing out the CO2 from the fat you're burning, you're contributing to greenhouse gases. Now for Japan's intention to build what is effectively a space ladder. The idea is simple. You have a structure out in space, well and truly out in space, and you tether it to a rather solid place on Earth. The idea is simply that you can then send things up the rather long tether to a space station and get them into space without ever having to launch rockets, because rockets are very expensive, at least by comparison to the idea of a space elevator. The advantages of this process are that rather than having to take rockets through Earth's atmosphere, which is a very labor-intensive process, and not just building rockets, but the fuel, resources, and so on and so forth needed for them, but then it also slows down any consequential travel after the fact, as most of the resources used are just to get it out of the atmosphere and into space. That's why getting to Mars could take up to 6 months, if not arguably more again. The most optimistic estimates, with a space ladder in play, bring this down to just 40 days, or a little over 1 and a bit months. The timeline for this is not anything that's going to be very impressive for most people, and that's because it's going to take about 25 years to build. And to be clear, that's not actually an unreasonable expectation. The reason why is you're building a structure that will be going over 100 kilometers up into the sky. Now, a large portion of that is going to be the rather obvious tether that links Earth to the satellite. But there'll have to be a huge amount of structure, resources, and services provided at ground level. You're essentially building an airport, attaching it to a giant rope, and then having to build a space station on top of it at the very end. Each of these individual achievements would be huge undertakings alone. The company involved, that being Obayashi Corporation, intends to start construction in 2025. There are, however, some questions about whether or not they could actually start next year or not. The other thing to consider is just how much it's going to lower the cost of moving things into space. A simple comparison is that it costs about $2,500 to move a kilogram of material into space on one of SpaceX's rockets. Obayashi Corporation says they could do the same sort of thing, but it would cost about $110 per kilogram. Admittedly, other estimates do place the cost of moving material into space this way at somewhere around $500 per kilogram, but nonetheless, this is a significant saving over the standard launch cost, at least by weight. The other consideration is, as mentioned, that Obayashi Corporation's not sure they will start construction next year. This is down to an issue around materials, development, various research aspects, and just being able to achieve the outcome that they want. But overall, it is far more progress than we've previously had with any kind of space ladder before now. In environmental news, we have a weird development in Alaska. Alaska's waterways are turning a weird yellowy-orange color. Normally, they'd be almost a stark blue, a very attractive color, and the environment looks stunning if not stark. But now they're turning an almost toxic color, and The reason why might surprise you. Rather than the typical expectation of something like algae blooms, this is down to the presence of metals. Now, iron's one of the first candidates that come to mind, and you'd be right to think that, and it's what's contributing to that almost orange juice coloration. But there's also the presence of zinc, copper, nickel, and lead. This has also contributed significantly to lowering the pH of this water. It's gone from somewhere around 8 down to 2.5. That's not something most animals can live in, and given the presence of metals, it's probably already incredibly toxic. Further to the bizarre occurrence, the actual cause is not as clear. Well, specifically, what's contributing to the metals polluting it isn't so clear. Based on satellite imagery from 1985 to the present, the event really only occurred in the last 10 years or thereabouts. And what it's coincided with is an increase in warm weather duration and increased snowfall. This would indicate that what's happening is snow is falling on the mountains and other areas around it, melting, and with it pulling away water that's been contaminated with various metals from those mountains. Now, given the relative recentness of this finding, it's fair to say that this may not be the whole explanation, but it is a reasonable explanation for the vast majority of what we're observing. The effects of this are going to be things like a salmon can no longer move upstream to spawn, and therefore we won't see salmon reproduce in the same way. But obviously other fish and other organisms will be in the same situation, so bears for instance. In further news that's related to geology, although this time ancient geology, we have 500 million year old rocks that could well explain whether or not the rain occurred in the very early stages of Earth. The research is a collaborative effort between China and Australia, and it uses crystals that are absolutely ancient, up to 4 billion years ago. These 4 billion year old rocks have various isotopes of oxygen trapped within them. And this kind of makes sense. After all, the formation of these crystals is, well, going to necessitate both oxygen presence, given that it acts as a binding agent in some ways, but also, well, water. Water is made up of oxygen and hydrogen. What's important about the oxygen in this case is that they were looking for a particular isotope, and the isotope they found was able to allow them to date the various crystals that they were examining, and they were able to get what is effectively a geological timeline by looking at how much of the certain isotopes are present at specific timestamps. This is pretty much a way of creating a quasi-timeline, mostly because, well, you're happening to be reasonably confident that what you're digging up and assessing is going to be from a particular strata, and if there wasn't any, say, geological movements or disruption, such as meteor landings, earthquakes, and so on, that caused the, let's say, mix-up of the various layers. Where this gets kind of interesting, at least from an evolutionary point of view, and to a lesser extent a development point of view, is that it establishes that, at least in theory, based on their findings, life could have started less than 600 million years after the Earth formed. This brings our timeline for life much more tighter to the Earth's development and occurrence. That's because it tells us about the time frame for not only the presence of water on Earth, but how cool or hot the Earth was at that particular time. Going from very old news to the modern day, and it's a ongoing thing called the dead internet theory. It's pretty much a proposal that AI, well, more accurately machine learning algorithms, have reached a point where they can generate content that is superior to what humans have generated, and therefore the creativity is all gone. That is, if you're an artist, a creator, or anything else, your work is effectively being replaced by AI, and that therefore everything is, to a lesser extent, controlled by artificial intelligence agents. But think of it as a way of effectively boosting engagement and any account, for example, leveling in video games, simply by having an automated system take over both the creation and, disturbingly, the observation and engagement with this work, completely removing the humanity from it, and not just in terms of humans no longer create the work, But humans aren't looking at the work either. All of the automated systems that Facebook, Google, YouTube, Twitter, TikTok, anything else use are all being taken advantage of because what they work on is the idea of increasing engagement. And because the automated AI systems engage with the content created by the AI, it doesn't really promote anything to humans. The problem as it's described is rather simple, that as these accounts that are created by an AI and then initially facilitated by AI followers gain more and more traction, they detract from the real human creators, essentially drawing away effectively the market share that they would otherwise have for humanity. And because humans no longer have a motivation in terms of the financial benefits they gain, they eventually just stop taking part, at least as far as creativity goes. Fortunately, we aren't there yet. And that's the big caveat to this. Not just is it that we're not there yet, but we are working towards that point, and that's the worry. Going from what is dead to what is supposedly being killed, and it's a claim in The Guardian that researchers were told to stop studying a mysterious brain illness. Now, this is arguably a very questionable claim, as it's effectively what every conspiracy nutter says that's happening, but there is at least a small amount of evidence to support it. And let's be clear, we are talking about circumstantial and questionable evidence at this stage. The research is based in Canada, and it's claimed by the scientists involved that they were looking into a mysterious brain illness in New Brunswick. They say that 200 people are infected by the condition, but they were also told that they were told to close their investigation. This is now over 200 patients, and they're all exhibiting a series of symptoms that are consistent with something like Prion disease, Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, or mad cow disease, if you will. For whatever reason, the government set up a committee to look into this. Now, that's not necessarily bad if they've not only got a disease they don't know about, but also that the disease they've got going is going to be something that can be communicated. Cutting it off early and stopping it from spreading is a good thing. But their finding, at least as far as the committee is concerned, is that most of the patients were misdiagnosed and were likely to have other diseases that were causing these symptoms, such as cancer and dementia. And therefore, the dozens of cases that the doctor had been handling really should just be closed down and dealt with as these other conditions. Now, there is one part of this that is completely insane, and it's unfortunately related to the doctor who raised the concern about it at the very start. They believe that the whole situation is being caused by glyphosate. No, glyphosate can't cause this. Glyphosate specifically can only kill certain plants because specific enzymatic pathways exist. It won't affect the folding of proteins, therefore it can't cause prion diseases. Second to that is that the mechanism of prion diseases is at least well enough understood that there are currently only two pathways for it to not only spread within the host, but there are even fewer ways again for someone to be infected by it. None of these involve the use of glyphosate. The only other major aspect to this which is a worry, and that is that it's very similar in some respects to what happened in the UK. In the UK, when they had a similar phenomena with, basically cows being fed processed meat that was a byproduct of the cows being slaughtered, eventually developed mad cow disease, and because of this, rather obviously, it became a massive problem, and it's why those who have donated blood in the UK are actually incredibly limited in donating blood outside of the UK. It's down to the simple fact that the blood that they donate could well be contaminated. The reason it got to that point is the UK government tried to ignore the issue and sweep it under the rug for as long as they possibly could until it became such a massive problem that they could no longer deny it. And it would appear, to some extent, that Canada may be doing the same thing, depending on how well established the underlying issue actually is. The final news item we have for you is a bizarre phenomena with publishing research, and it's a PhD student who's had a large part of their thesis taken and published as an independent study, effectively plagiarizing it, and arguably they have very clearly plagiarized it. A publication was made called Taro Roots, an underexploited root crop. Now, this paper is pretty much a word-for-word copy in some parts of their own thesis, and that's not a good thing. Their response to finding this interesting paper, interesting being a rather sarcastic phrase in this case, is to raise concerns with not only the university that the researcher is at, but also the journal it was published in. And the response was that it was an unfortunate omission of any citation to their work. Omission is not the right word. When you do this, it is effectively not necessarily malpractice, but equivalent to in academia. It's an integrity issue at a minimum, and at a worst case scenario, it's outright fraud. The way the journal and the university has been able to get around this is that they claim that the thesis was not a published work, which is plain and simple bullshit. Not only is it peer-reviewed by the examiners who consider the thesis, but it's also been published and made available, generally speaking, through the university. The university basically publishes it as part of their library. Therefore, it was published just by the university, and it is available to anyone who wants to read it. This would be how the individual in question was able to get the content. Now, this is not a one-off event in terms of the work being used. The key being that in the other times it was used, the work was cited. So if 6 other publications can do this, there is no reason why the person responsible, or people responsible for this publication, could not do so themselves. The sad part to all this is that the Nutrients Journal not only basically has dismissed the complaint, not considering it plagiarism, but more importantly, they've basically gone out of their way to ignore the problem, and it means Nutrients is not living up to its standards, and not just as a peer-reviewed journal, but to uphold any degree of integrity. This is not a situation in which a correction to provide appropriate citations is an adequate response, and more so when it's taking them months and months to make the amendment to include that citation. It's just outright wrong. With that rather disappointing news, that's all the news we have for you this week. Thank you for watching. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. And please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.